Crimson Sea is fascinating. From about when Doom made them cool, 3D shooters pretty much ruled the PC space, and developers tried very hard to get them working on console, but quickly ran into an issue regarding controls. See, console controllers were significantly more limiting than what you would get on PC, and developers would have to work around that when designing shooters for console, and especially when porting existing PC shooters over. As a result, where PC shooters all had an almost uniform feel for most of the 90s, console shooters were a little more of a Wild West, where none of your skills would ever transfer over to another game in the slightest. There was still the odd good game coming from this, but even they felt hamstrung at times by the hardware they came out for. However, two things would happen that would ultimately lead console shooters to be almost on par with PC gaming. First, the DualShock. Both Sony and Sega would launch analog versions of their own console's controllers soon after the N64 came out, with Sony's double-stick approach being the more influential of the two, even if it saw very limited use on the original PlayStation. All of the major console manufacturers would adopt a dual-stick controller in the following console generation, except Sega for some reason, but we all know what happened to them. The other catalyst was the most important game of the generation dropping at the start of the new console generation. It goes without saying that Halo was a goddamn massive game, and you've probably heard everything I'd have to say about it before, but the most important thing is that unlike past shooters on console, it felt pretty much on par with what was coming out on PC. Halo just feels natural on a controller, almost as natural as it does with the keyboard and mouse controls PC gamers were used to. More than anything, Halo showed the world how to really make shooters work on a controller. But it wasn't an immediate process or anything. Games take time to develop, and lessons from one game don't necessarily always apply to other games that came out later on. Enter Crimson Sea, an Xbox-exclusive shooter from late 2002 that learned absolutely nothing from Halo and might as well not even use the right stick. Crimson Sea follows the adventures of some guy named Sho who works as a private detective after he is drafted into a military organization called the Intelligence Agency of the Galaxy, or IAG for short. That's about as much as you'll get out of the story before you inevitably lose track of it all and it just becomes some weird fever dream. Large chunks of the game's story feel like they're missing entirely, leaving character arcs feeling very unnatural and unfinished. There's basically no chemistry between anyone, and all the characters feel super wooden. Deez gets the worst of it. She pretty much feels tacked on to the story. She never interacts with anyone, but by the end of it, you're supposed to believe that she's developed some kind of bond with the rest of them, and really trusts Sho for some reason. It's not like any of this really matters, though. Crimson Sea isn't exactly trying to have a deep and interesting storyline. It just kind of has a story to justify what you're doing in the game, and not much more than that. So it won't take long for you to just completely lose track of the story, but it sure is special anyway. If nothing else, just how haphazard the narrative is, and how often cutscenes just end in what feels like the middle of the scene gives it a charm of its own, especially when you combine it with the dub, which in typical Koei fashion feels like it was done by a direct-to-video Christian movie studio and is just delightful.
Sho, you mustn't listen to him! I won't let you go. I will find a way to make you human again.
Shami.
So this is the she-devil that's been tempting you. No problem. I'll get rid of that temptation.
Shami! Deez, take her! How dare you! This is someone I care about!
In terms of gameplay, as previously stated, Crimson Sea is a third-person shooter with elements of hack and slash and role-playing, although don't expect anything too fleshed out on either front. The RPG elements amount to a little more than what you would find in a Ratchet & Clank type of game, and more than anything you're just going to be shooting at things until they die and dodging enemy attacks. The control scheme, though, is what makes Crimson Sea unique, for better or for worse. Crimson Sea has tank controls, although you can shuffle movement by holding down the left trigger. It's not a particularly awful control scheme, especially since most enemies aren't particularly spongy, and the game has fairly generous auto-aim, but it takes some getting used to. I feel like it would have been better if instead they had made both triggers strafe, since as it is right now you can't turn and strafe at the same time. which makes turning corners a little less natural than it should be, but if I'm being honest, the only times I really found myself frustrated with the controls were during bosses. The right trigger is reserved for a lock-on mode, which is completely useless for fighting most regular enemies since auto-aim is already very generous and they go down like a tenth of a second, but it's something you're going to be needing for bosses a lot since circle strafing is kinda impossible otherwise, which would be fine except the lock-on breaks extremely easily and stops you in your tracks when it does. There's also a manual aiming mode you can do by pressing both triggers and when there's nothing in lock-on range, which is useful a grand total of 0 times and I'm not even sure why it's in the game. That said, credit where it's due, the developers try their best to make the controls work despite this. Pressing the dodge button while stationary does a quick turn and show himself as nimble enough that he doesn't feel particularly bad to move around as. It's just that in assessing Crimson Sea, we have to assess it as a game that came out a year after Halo, and it's kinda obvious which game feels better. You have a decent variety of weapons to choose from in Crimson Sea, although you only really need a handful of them. Every weapon has unlimited ammo and just runs on a cooldown system, so you really have no reason to use anything other than the Vulcan. And not to be confused with the Volcano, until right around Mission 20, where you need to buy the Volcano, not to be confused with the Vulcan, in order to have the boss go down in less than 5 years. Also, the Volcano might be the shittiest rocket launcher I've ever used in a game. It locks out your control entirely as soon as you fire it, including your aim, until the animation finishes, making it a nightmare to use in basically any context. In theory, you could get more use out of the different psionics, which all serve a useful function, whether to heal yourself and nearby party, to damage all enemies in the area, or really for any number of reasons. Can you tell I only use like 2 of these? But the way you swap between them kinda disincentivizes using more than one regularly. There's no quick select, you have to go into the party menu to switch between them, which feels very slow and clunky. Same with weapons, actually. It's incredibly weird, especially since the D-pad isn't even used for anything. My Blasphere only got up to like level 2 before getting pretty much benched after I got cured because it was such a pain to equip it that I avoided using it as much as possible. So it was pretty much useless barring the most paper-thin of enemies. So to make a long story short, the game feels a bit of a mixed bag. It doesn't feel egregiously terrible, but there's a lot. God damn it. But there's a lot that could easily be improved about it. If nothing else, it's got its own feel though, so there's a novelty to how janky it is, at the very least. The other elements of play are just about as mixed. Crimson Sea runs on a mission-based level structure, and it's at its best when the mission in question is essentially just get to the end of the level while blasting weird bug things along the way. Some of the more gimmicky missions can be fine too, but there are a few notably bad ones that stand out. Pretty much any mission that asks you to hunt for a bunch of enemies on a timer is the worst part of the game, outside this one tailing mission that I cheesed completely on accident. Alright, screw it. I've got to be missing something here. What does this long play do? Oh, I won? Huh? Oh. I have written down in my notes, Agito military plant's boss is the funniest thing in the world, which, maybe. The bosses in general feel kinda clunky, especially with what I said about lock-on. Once I got to the first encounter with Ekdal, I just gave up trying to win with honor, and just resorted to tanking hits and spamming Volcano 3 as much as I could. That actually gave me better results than actually trying to fight the bosses. Make of that what you will. This is going to be kind of a weird one, I guess, because Crimson Sea is definitely a very flawed game, but despite the litany of flaws, I think the core shooter gameplay is generally strong enough to make up for the many little things it gets wrong. Your machine gun feels solid to fire, and mowing down hordes of paper-thin enemies feels weirdly satisfying. It has kind of that Dynasty Warriors feel, to the point I assumed for the longest time it was an Omega Force game, but no, this is Koei proper on this one. I really wouldn't blame you for coming out of this thinking I absolutely hated the game with how much I've deep dived its flaws, but I say this with sincerity, I had a lot of fun with Crimson Sea. It's got satisfying gunplay, a unique and interesting control scheme, and just the corniest dub in the world.
Can I count you in? It's not a bad job, you know. And since you're broke, the timing is certainly right. I can see you think there's something fishy about the deal. Trust me. It's just that I'm a mysterious and sexy woman with a slightly lawless aura. Still, after you do this for me, you'll never be hungry again.
Part of that might just be because I have a high tolerance for PS2 urging, but I don't know, there's something here that kept me wanting to push through and see all the game had to offer even when it was pissing me off. It's definitely not hard to see why this game isn't talked about more today, though. With everything I just said in mind, this game was exclusively released for the Xbox, literally the same system Halo had already released for 13 months prior, and let's be real, if you had an Xbox, you had Halo. I mean, what else was there? Blink's the Time Sweeper? Compared to that, which was at the time the best feeling console shooter ever made, Crimson Sea was always going to feel dated, though it might have stood a better chance if it was released on other platforms, like, say, the PS2. Koei chose to remedy this by making the sequel available on PS2. And only PS2, and never ported the original over for the rest of us. Yeah, what were they thinking? Admittedly, I've heard more people talk about the sequel than the original game, but that's not really saying much. You're comparing a sample size of 3 to a sample size of nobody. Regardless, looking at gameplay footage a second, it definitely looks like they figured out what worked in the first game and what didn't, so I'm definitely stoked to give that one a whirl. And while we're here, why don't we do just that? Crimson Sea 2 is exactly what the original should have been. It's still obviously a janky PS2 Koei game, but pretty much everything that worked about the first game works just as well or better here, and what didn't has either been cut or improved so as to be more or less a non-issue. Which is weird to say considering it's on much weaker hardware than the original, but even at that it doesn't feel like it's been compromised all that much to fit the new performance target. It's no less visually detailed than the original to my eye at least, nor does it feel less packed with enemies, and it maintains the same target frame rate as the original. In fact, it actually does a better job hitting it than that one did. Really the only meaningful trade-off to coming to the PS2 is the game no longer displays in progressive scan. Ignore my footage being 30 FPS, the actual game runs at 60, my capture card just forces a de-interlacing method that caps the frame rate to 30 FPS on interlaced footage. You can also really tell when the game loads in a new part of the map this time around, and they avoid showing off water because rendering water taxes the hardware something fierce, but those are really the only other compromises I noticed. Story-wise, it's still nothing to write home about, really. It's a good bit easier to parse this time around and slightly more interesting than whatever the first game was trying to do, but it's still very bland with quote-unquote characters that feel extremely one-dimensional, thanks in no small part to their still delightfully wooden dub performances.
After that is your dinner meeting with Senator-elect Jarkins. Princess, your schedule just will not allow you to visit some rundown refugee camp. Princess,
What's wrong? What's happening?
calm down.
Help! Is she
You.
okay?
Call a medic. Hurry.
What a fool. To push so hard you pass out. You're a princess, for goodness sake.
It's because I am a princess.
It's basically just your standard good guy versus bad guy plot. There's some attempt at an internal conflict going on, but all things considered, you're not going to be playing either of these games for the story, so how's about we skip to what you're actually here for? Crimson Sea 2's most immediate improvement over the first game is that it no longer forces tank controls on you. They're still there as an option, but you have 3 different control settings you can choose from. One of which being a more freeform system, somewhat more suited to the running gun style of these games, which is the one I went with. By default, the game does a sort of in-between scheme where it switches to tank controls while the fire button is held down. I don't know why you'd want to play like this, but maybe someone does. For my money though, go with option B. It's the most fun scheme to use easily. And yeah, once you do that, it feels excellent. I know in this modern age, the idea of a 3D shooter tying aiming to your movement sounds like lunacy, but considering this is a run and gun type of game where you're going to be using spray and pray a lot of the time, this feels significantly more natural than manual aim for that. I would have appreciated at least having the option for manual aiming though, especially considering there's a dedicated straight shift button, which for some reason does not let you adjust your aim while using it, despite the right stick having proper camera controls on it. Small nitpick though, otherwise I have no beefs. The gunplay felt good in the first game, and it feels even better here thanks to the more responsive controls combined with a much more useful lock-on. It can still break, but it's nowhere near as comically fragile as it was in the first game, only really breaking when you take damage when you would realistically lose track of the target in-universe. There's also no longer a dedicated dodge button, with the game instead adopting a combination jump and dodge approach, similar to how other PS2-era action games would usually approach it. This jump dodge feels way snappier and nicer to use than the awkward dash the first game had, and accommodates the more expanded hack-and-slash elements really nicely. There is a bit less weapon variety, though, with each character only getting 2 weapons, although considering only 2 guns in the first game were worth using at all, it's hardly a loss, especially when this time around they can be freely swapped without jumping into a menu. And you might have noticed I said each character there. Crimson Sea 2 features a second playable character named Fine, although don't expect a majorly different character. She's essentially just Sho, but with different guns and psionics. She wields a different melee weapon, but as far as practical use is concerned, that's not real worth thinking about. It's functionally the same. The biggest difference between their arsenals is that Sho's guns are more about focusing your attention on one target for heavy damage, hence he has an assault rifle and a shotgun, whereas Fine's are more about crowd control. The lightning gun feels really satisfying to use, especially leveled up, when it fucking shreds into everyone. And a sort of missile launcher I rarely use because it sucks ass. Both are about as viable as each other for most missions, so if you were to swap between the two regularly like I did, you won't have to think too hard about when you do it. I just swapped when I felt like a change of pace, and it never felt much like my current choice of character was a hindrance in the mission I was on. Although if you were to go for S ranks, there's obviously a best choice on each mission, although if you're going for S ranks, you probably know which one's which anyway. So, in addition to polishing the shooter elements up, the game also refined its RPG elements a bit. Instead of how the first game handles things, where you simply make a thing better by using it more often, now you have a normal per-character leveling system and a skill point system, referred to as origins for some reason, which are dropped by enemies in which you instead manually assign to certain skills to upgrade them. The system I prefer, since you have more control on how you evolve over time and aren't forced to play like an idiot just to make sure everything's optimally leveled. The hack and slash elements are also expanded a good amount, although still don't go in expecting anything too fancy. This is no Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. You have a 4-hit combo, a heavy attack you can end a combo with, a ground slash in midair, and a super move in the form of the reworked psionics. More or less what you would have in Dynasty Warriors, plus the gunplay. It gets away with it largely because of the genre mixing, much like how Dynasty Warriors gets away with having simple combat because the combat isn't the main challenge of those games, and in that regard I don't really have much to complain about. It has that same satisfying, meaty feel to it Koei hack and slashes are known for, and works well as a complement to the running and gunning. Although I wish Gravity Blade, your heavy attack, worked differently. You pull it off by attacking while the stick is pointed to the direction your character's back is facing, which makes it hard to do while not locked onto one enemy, except by accident when you're trying to get someone behind you. You get used to it after a bit, but it could still be executed better. Psionics are altered as well, now functioning more as a super move rather than like RPG magic. A change I'm honestly fine with since it means less fiddling with menus. This is the other way in which Sho and Fine differ. They both share the same starting psionic, but the others are exclusive. Sho gets an area of effect blast and a focused laser beam, whereas Fine gets a spinning top move and a hailstorm. The hailstorm sucks, by the way. Beyond that, there's a bit more of a focus on damage combos, since every time you reach a combo of any multiple of 30, you enter a bullet time state where you don't lose any ammo when firing your gun and enemies move around slower. For the most part, this doesn't mean that much, but it makes clearing out huge crowds of mooks just a little bit more satisfying, and I have the reason to pay attention to your ammo gauge, since, much like the first one, there is no reload button, the game instead auto-reloading whenever you're not shooting. And with that, I think I've gone into far more detail on the systems of this game than I expected, but I've basically exhausted that part of the discussion. All in all, combat in Crimson Sea 2 is very satisfying. At points, it actually reminds me of a much more polished and focused version of Jet Force Gemini, another game I always liked the feel of, even if it definitely has a fair share of issues of its own. But if there's one place the game feels like a step down from the first game, and it's gotta be in its pacing and progression. So, the first game runs on a very simple formula where you go to a level, do one mission, and you're done and move on to the next. You're always progressing from one beat to the next at a fairly breakneck pace, and it's over before lunchtime. A nice, satisfying adventure, aside from the ways in which it was not. Crimson Sea 2 keeps that mission-based level structure, but adds in side missions that use the same map as the key missions, 4 per level aside from the first level, which has 3, And the last level, which obviously has none. You thankfully don't have to do all of them. I mean, they are side missions after all, but you do have to achieve a certain percentage of cleared missions on each of the 3 planets in order to unlock the key mission of each map. In addition to killing the pace of progression, this can feel a bit monotonous when combined with the fairly linear design of each map, especially if you try to do all of them, which I gave up on after almost completing the second planet and getting frustrated with one particularly bad mission. But everything else bad I could feasibly say about Crimson Sea 2 would just be presentation nitpicks, mostly applying to the first game anyway. I didn't touch much on the presentation when talking about said first game, because I figure it would be redundant to do so for both, and that's pretty much the case as it turns out. Neither game especially excels here, with the soundtrack being serviceable but not particularly memorable, and the visuals being competent but lacking much in the way of style. One unique problem to the second, though, is the way cutscenes are handled. Every cutscene was voiced in the first game aside from incidental dialogue when engaging with another character on a ship or in a mission, but in the second, several key cutscenes are left without voiceover, which wouldn't be much of an issue except pressing any button skips the entire scene with no warning. I found myself skipping a bunch of cutscenes because my instincts told me to press X after reading just a single line of dialogue all the way through. Having said all that, however, how is Crimson Sea 2? It's really damn good. A solid mix of hack and slash with running and shooting more than makes up for a forgettable story and awkward progression structure. It's by no means a perfect game, but I can easily recommend it if you're into this sort of game. It holds up surprisingly well today. Hi, I intended to have a second video out much sooner than this. I actually did not originally plan on doing this one for the second video, but the game that I was trying to do a video on before that, I got all the footage recorded, I got a rough draft of the script ready, and I just could not get it into a state I was happy with, so yeah, I just scrapped that one, and now we're doing this, and, but yeah, that's basically it. I'll see you guys for fucking Rugrats Search for Reptar or something, I don't know.